Slava Jesu Christu, and greetings to all my friends and former parishioners at St. Basil's Parish in Edmonton. It's my pleasure to be with you on for these few days. I want to thank Father Serafim for inviting me to lead this online mission with you this year. I would much rather that I was be able to be with you, but at least we have this opportunity, at least on an online version, to be with you and to communicate with you a little bit in this way, and to pass this time of great Lent, at least in this small way. I'm standing in the chapel of the dormitory building here in Stamford, Connecticut, of the dormitory which was built in 1942 to house the students of St. Basil's preparatory school at that time. Now this building is located on a property of 9 acres. There's 5 large buildings on this property. And this land was purchased in 1933 by the bishop at that time, the only Ukrainian Catholic bishop in America, Bishop Konstantin Bohachevsky, in 1933. And it's said, this is kind of an urban legend, that he bought it for $80,000 in cash, which he brought up by train in a paper bag from Philadelphia to pay for this land. Now, of course, this land and these buildings and the additions that have been made are worth a lot more than that. This building this chapel especially is unique in the fact that the iconography here, which you can only see a small part, was done by the noted iconographer named Jan de Rosen. He was, I think, a Polish Jew who was converted to Christianity. He lived in the last century, the 20s and 30s, and he decorated many churches and chapels in Western Ukraine and in Poland and in Western Europe before emigrating to the United States. And I think his most famous work is the huge mosaic of Christ in glory, which is housed in the apse of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. So if you ever have a chance to visit Washington, D.C., of course you'll visit the National Shrine. It's a huge church building, and the very impressive mosaic of Christ in glory is by Jan de Rosen, who did the iconography in this chapel. And this chapel is noted for the fact that back in the 40s and 50s, this was the seminary chapel, and all the students, the seminarians, prayed here every day. And in one of these pews also sat and prayed a seminarian who would later become the patriarch of our church, Cardinal Lubomir Huzar. So today is the day of the Annunciation to our Blessed Mother. And today in the Gospel reading of the Divine Liturgy, which I think you just were present at today, right before this sermon, we heard the words, "Hail, full of grace." Now these are the words of Gabriel to Mary. Now Gabriel, of course, he didn't say these words to Zechariah, for instance, who was the father of St. John the Baptist, whom he also appeared to, who was a man, of course, and he was a priest and educated. He didn't say, "Hail, full of grace" to him, but he said these words rather to Mary, to this lowly girl, Mary. And this shows that even though Mary held no prominent position in her society, even though she was poor, even though she was unmarried, even though she was uneducated, and to top it off, she was a woman. In other words, even though she was of extremely low status in her society, it proves that God still loved her, that God still held her in great esteem. And in a way we can say that she is the forerunner of all those in the Christian life who will be judged by people, you and I, as unworthy of God's grace. Because we judge people all the time, don't we? We judge them. And judge them as being lower than ourselves, as being unworthy of God's grace. And so Mary is a forerunner of all of those, and goes to prove that the people that we judge as being unworthy are esteemed in the eyes of God. When Gabriel says this greeting to her, what's her answer? Well, she says she is the servant or the handmaid of the Lord. Let this be done according to your word. This is what we read in the different translations of our Bibles. But I think this term is a little bit too delicate. It doesn't really convey to us the real meaning of this word, servant or handmaid. We kind of take the edge off of it. Because if you look at the original Greek meaning of this word, it translates in Greek as slave. So she's saying to Gabriel, not that I am the handmaid of the Lord, not even the servant of the Lord, but I am the slave of the Lord. So that's one thing to keep in mind. This event in the life of the Blessed Mother, the event of her Annunciation, it makes me wonder about a few specific things. The first is that here we have this incursion of the extraordinary into the ordinary life of a young woman. And it really was an incursion. It was like an invasion. It was something that was not asked for by Mary. And it's the incursion of something extraordinary into the very ordinary life of that young girl. And secondly, another thing that makes me wonder about this event is how a simple decision of this young girl, this yes, changes history, both her own personal history and the history of the world, and the history of human salvation. And the third thing that I kind of wonder about when I read the gospel account of the Annunciation is how God chooses the unlikeliest of people to do His work. Because there was no one who was more unlikely to be the vehicle of God than was this humble, unmarried, uneducated girl in Nazareth, whose name was Mary. And it makes me wonder, because what happened to Mary on that day happens to us in very real ways. We are Mary in very real ways, in many ways. The same thing that happens to Mary happens to us. For example, we see in this gospel account that God initiates the conversation with Mary. She's not expecting it. She's just going about her daily business. And then Gabriel comes to her. And it's the same thing in our lives as well, isn't it? Sometimes God comes to us in very unexpected ways. Perhaps we are touched by the Word of God as we are reading Holy Scripture, and it speaks to us in a way that has never spoken before. Or perhaps when we are suffering something, emotionally or physically, perhaps a friend's word of comfort to us, it strikes us. It kind of goes to our heart, and it speaks to us almost as if the words of our friend are the words of God Himself. Or perhaps when we go out in nature and we see the autumn leaves on a sunny fall afternoon. That's one thing in this area of the eastern seaboard of the United States, is that in the autumn the trees turn spectacular colors that we don't have we don't see too much of in Alberta. And really, when you see that, when you walk in the woods and see this expanse of color, it leaves you speechless with the beauty of God's nature. And so God can speak to us in that way as well, through nature, or through a beautiful piece of music. So that's how, that we can say that God can speak to us. Also, when we realize that God is really actually speaking to us, sometimes we react in different ways. Sometimes we react instinctively in fear and in trepidation in the face of the unknown, as did Mary, didn't she? She was troubled. And she thought to herself, well, what does this angel want with me? What can God be possibly saying to me? Mary said to herself, I'm small, I'm insignificant. How can God use me? And we say the same things to ourselves at those moments when we perceive that God is speaking to us. Who are we to have God speak to us? Who am I? How can I be the instrument of God in whatever way He wants me to be? Holy tradition over the years has given us the image of Mary as someone who was very powerful. For instance, we have that beautiful and very powerful mosaic of the Oranta in the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, where she's holding her omophora, her mantle over us in protection, interceding for us. And she doesn't look too, if you've ever seen pictures of it, or if you've had the opportunity to actually visit St. Sophia's in Kiev, you can see she doesn't look too delicate there. She looks very powerful. She's the nebrushema stina, the unshakable wall. So we have that image of a very powerful Mother of God protecting us from all evil. But we forget that in her life on earth, that she was, well, first of all, a woman, in other words, weak, that she was young, that she was poor, that she was uneducated, that she lived in a very unknown kind of a backwater town, and that she was a Jew. She was a Jewish woman living in a land which was ruled by the Romans, by the Roman Empire. In other words, she had no power. She had no status or standing in the society in which she lived. She had no influence with anyone. And she was powerless to influence anyone or anything. And yet God chose her, exactly her, to bring His message to the earth, and to use her as His vehicle to bring the Son of God to earth with this proposition. Sometimes I think if Gabriel were to come to our modern world today, to visit a young girl, to propose the same thing as he proposed to Mary 2,000 years ago, and to keep to the same parameters as he did then he wouldn't come to a 13-year-old girl in Stamford or in Edmonton. He would choose to come to a girl in the poorest village in the most remotest part of Africa. A girl who had no power, no influence, no education. So what could anybody possibly expect from her? And I think that once Mary heard this proposition from Gabriel, and what she was telling him, what he was telling her, that she understood this. She may have been young and uneducated, but she was certainly nobody's fool. She knew that she was powerless. So her natural reaction was, how can this be? How can what you are telling me come to pass? And we ask the same question many times in our own lives. When both good things and bad things happen to us. Many of us have been asking ourselves the same question during this past year of the pandemic that has taken us by surprise and has changed our lives so completely and so dramatically, and has taken from our lives so many people whom we love. How can it be, we ask, in the face of illness or in the face of the death of a loved one? How can this be? Or when we lose our job, or when we have to endure a broken friendship or a broken marriage. How can this be? We ask God. Just as Mary asked God to the angel Gabriel. And we find that Gabriel, what does he say? He's very gentle with her. Quite a contrast to how he reacted with Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. We recall that when he doubted his word then, when Gabriel came to him while he was in the temple in Jerusalem, when he doubted, that Gabriel wasn't so gentle. He made him speechless, right? He made him speechless until the birth of John the Baptist himself, when he returned the gift of speech to him. But Gabriel's gentle with Mary. The angel Gabriel simply asks her to look around her at what's happening and says to her, your kinswoman Elizabeth has conceived in her 6th month. And this woman who was deemed as barren is now in her 6th month of pregnancy. So Gabriel is saying, in other words, you have doubts about the power of God. Look around you. Look at the miracles that he has already done. Your cousin Elizabeth, an old woman, is going to have a baby. So looking backwards at what God has done already helps Mary to look forward and see what he can do for her. So just the same, we have to ask ourselves, have we gone through tough times in the past and even now? Of course we have, and of course we are. And wasn't God with us then and now? Didn't he show in different ways that he was with us, that he did not abandon us? Well, yes, of course. And so, if then why not now? If God can make, an old woman have a child, then he can help us here and now in our difficulties. Each of us can say this in our own lives. If we look back and see what God has done for us in the past, then we can have confidence in the future. And finally, I think Mary realizes this as well. And once she realizes this, then she freely, of her own accord, answers to Gabriel. She says yes. She freely gives her consent. Yes, let it be according to the will of God with me. I am his handmaid, his servant, his slave. And this is something we seldom think about, but it's very important. When she says yes, she doesn't ask for permission of anyone. She doesn't ask for permission from Joseph, who was her husband, her legal husband even at that time, even though they weren't living together yet. She doesn't ask permission, let's say, of her father, as she was bound to do. She couldn't do anything on her own. She was an underage woman. And in that society, she had no rights to make any decisions for herself whatsoever. She was completely dependent on the men in her life. But God, with this visit, with this proposition, God had freed her, released her from these human constraints, from the constraints of those societal norms that had been placed upon her and placed on every woman of her society. His grace, the grace of God, had made her a free woman, free to say yes without fear. So what we have here is this beautiful paradox, something that we can meditate upon for hours and days. Here we have a young woman with no power who agrees to be the vehicle of bringing the most powerful one, Jesus Christ, into the world. So someone with no power, no status, no influence, agrees to bring the most powerful one into the world. And if she had not agreed, then he would not have come. So powerless, but with so much power. What a paradox. And again, proof that God can do anything. So she consented with grace and with courage and in a physical way to the presence of God in her life. Not just a spiritual presence, yes, God is with me, but in the physical presence that God would be growing in her womb. Mary was also told that her son would be the Son of God, Emmanuel, that his kingdom would have no end. But she was significant here also that she was not told other things. She was not told by Gabriel that he would be tortured or crucified or buried, or that he would rise on the third day after being brutally murdered. So Mary says yes. She gives her fiat to a future she does not and cannot know. And again, it's something that we do every day of our lives, every day of our Christian lives. We say yes to a future that we cannot know. Every yes to God changes and transforms our lives. Sometimes in very big ways, like when we profess our marriage vows, or when we accept perhaps a new job, or to go to a school in a foreign country, or when we choose to make religious vows. These yeses to God, they transform our lives in very big ways. But there are a myriad of other small ways every day, many times a day, when we have the option of saying yes to God. Saying yes to God rather than to the temptations of the evil one and what he proposes for us. And every time we say yes to virtue, yes to the good, and no to sin and to temptation, God changes our lives, even in those small ways. And by this series of yeses, we become transformed. And ultimately, we become free, just as free as Mary was. Just as free as Mary became with her yes to God. So my dear brothers and sisters, one thing we have to remember is that our Christian life is not a prison. It's not a jail, like so many in our modern society would have us believe. The Christian life is not a series of not a series of no's. It's not something, the Christian life is not something that shackles us in chains and prevents us from fulfilling ourselves, like our modern society tells us. Rather, the Christian life is a series of yeses. Yes. Yes to freedom in God. Yes to living our lives as they were intended by God, as Mary did. And this is the freedom that we are seeking during this time of Great Lent. Let the Most Holy Mother of God show us the way. Slava Isusu Christu.